My mom abandoned me for her new family, leaving me to fend for myself. Years later, she came crawling back when her perfect life fell apart. I'm 28 now, but this story really begins when I was 12. Up until then, I had what I thought was a pretty normal life. My parents, Sarah and Tom, seemed happy enough. We lived in a cozy 2-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, with a backyard where Dad and I would play catch on weekends. Mom worked as a real estate agent, and Dad was an accountant at a local firm. I was doing well in school, had a small group of close friends, and was starting to get into soccer. Looking back, there were signs that things weren't as perfect as they seemed. I remember overhearing hushed arguments late at night, seeing my mom's forced smile at family dinners, noticing how my dad would sometimes sleep on the couch. But kids have a way of normalizing things, you know? I just thought that's how all families were. Everything changed one sunny Saturday in July. I remember it vividly. I had just come back from a morning at the local pool with my best friend, Jake. Mom was waiting for me in the living room, sitting rigidly on the edge of the sofa. She patted the seat next to her and said we needed to have a talk. I knew something was wrong immediately. Mom's eyes were red-rimmed, and her voice had a tremor I'd never heard before. She took a deep breath and told me she was leaving. Not just Dad, but me too. She had met someone else, a guy named Steve, who made her truly happy for the first time in her life. Steve had 2 kids of his own, a boy my age and a girl a couple years younger. Mom was going to move in with them, about 3 hours away. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I remember feeling like I was in some kind of bizarre dream. But what about me? I asked, my voice small and scared. She gave me a sad smile and said she needed a fresh start, and that meant leaving everything behind, including me. I begged her to stay, to take me with her, anything. I promised to be better, to keep my room cleaner, to get straight A's. But she just patted my head, told me I'd understand when I was older, and said she'd already packed her bags. Dad was at work, she'd left him a letter explaining everything. And just like that, my mom walked out the door and out of my life. The next few hours were a blur. I sat on the couch, shell-shocked, until Dad came home. I'll never forget the look on his face when he read that letter. It was like watching someone's whole world crumble in real time. He tried to put on a brave face for me, but I could see the pain and betrayal in his eyes. The next few years were hell. Dad, bless him, tried his best, but he was a wreck. He started drinking heavily, first just in the evenings, then during the day too. He'd forget to buy groceries, forget to pay bills. He lost his job at the accounting firm after showing up drunk one too many times. We ended up having to sell the house and move to a tiny, run-down apartment in a not-so-great part of town. I went from being a happy, outgoing kid to a sullen, angry teenager almost overnight. I acted out at school, got into fights, and my grades plummeted. I lost touch with most of my old friends, partly because we'd moved to a different school district, and partly because I pushed everyone away. The pain and abandonment I felt turned into a simmering rage that colored everything in my life. Meanwhile, my mom's new life seemed picture perfect. She'd post constant updates on social media about her beautiful blended family. There were photos of family vacations to Disneyland, fancy holiday dinners, school events where she cheered on her new stepkids. It was like I didn't exist anymore. She'd send the occasional text on my birthday or Christmas, generic messages like "Hope you're doing well. Happy birthday." But that was it. No calls, no visits, nothing. I'd scroll through her posts late at night, torturing myself with glimpses of the life I could have had. In one photo, she was teaching Steve's daughter how to bake cookies, something she'd never had the patience to do with me. In another, she was at a father-son baseball game, cheering on Steve and his son. Each picture was like a knife twisting in my gut. By the time I was 16, things had gotten really bad at home. Dad was drunk more often than not, and we were barely scraping by. Our apartment was a mess, dirty dishes piled in the sink, empty bottles littering the floor. I was skipping school more often than not, hanging out with a rough crowd, experimenting with drugs and alcohol myself. I think I was trying to numb the pain, to feel something, anything other than the constant ache of abandonment. Child services got involved after one of my teachers reported signs of neglect. I came home one day to find a social worker in our living room, talking to my dad who could barely stand up straight. Despite my anger towards him, in that moment, all I felt was fear and protectiveness. I tried to convince the social worker that everything was fine, that Dad was just having a bad day. But it was no use. I ended up in foster care. My first placement was with an older couple, the Johnsons. They were nice enough, but they had 3 other foster kids and didn't have much time or energy for a troubled teen like me. I acted out even more, staying out late, getting into trouble with the law for petty theft and vandalism. It was during this time that I reached out to my mom again. I thought surely she'd step up now that things had gotten so bad. I swallowed my pride and called her, telling her about Dad's drinking, about foster care, about how lost I felt. Her response? "I'm sorry you're going through this, but I have my own family to think about now. I'm sure you'll be fine. You've always been strong." That was the moment I decided to cut her out of my life completely. I blocked her number, unfriended her on all social media, and told myself I didn't have a mother anymore. The pain of that second rejection was almost worse than the first. It confirmed what I'd feared all along, that I was truly unwanted, unlovable. The next few years were a blur of foster homes, each one blending into the next. Some were okay, others were nightmares. I bounced around, never staying in one place for more than a few months. My grades were in the toilet, and I had pretty much given up on the idea of any kind of future. But then, when I was 17, I landed in the home of Mike and Linda Garcia. They were different from my other foster parents. Mike owned a local garage, and Linda was a high school counselor. They had 2 grown kids of their own and had been fostering for years. From the start, they treated me differently, not like some troubled kid they had to deal with, but like a person worthy of respect and care. Mike offered me a part-time job at his garage after school. At first, I thought he was just trying to keep me out of trouble, but I soon realized he genuinely wanted to teach me. He showed me how to change oil, rotate tires, and eventually, how to diagnose and fix more complex issues. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of accomplishment, of pride in something I was doing. Linda, for her part, didn't try to force me to talk about my feelings or my past. Instead, she just provided a steady, calm presence. She helped me with my homework without making me feel stupid, and always made sure there was a home-cooked meal on the table, something I hadn't experienced in years. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I started to change. I started going to school regularly, not because I suddenly loved it, but because I didn't want to disappoint Mike and Linda. My grades began to improve. I cut ties with my old troublemaking friends and even joined the school's auto club. By some miracle, I managed to graduate high school. It wasn't with honors or anything, but considering where I'd been just a year earlier, it felt like a massive achievement. Mike and Linda were there at my graduation, cheering louder than anyone when I walked across the stage. I couldn't afford college, and honestly, I wasn't sure I was cut out for it anyway. But Mike offered me a full-time position at his garage, and I jumped at the chance. Over the next few years, I threw myself into learning everything I could about cars. I discovered I had a knack for it. There was something soothing about the logic of engines, the satisfaction of diagnosing a problem and fixing it. By the time I was 23, I had saved up enough to rent a small apartment of my own. It wasn't much, a studio with a kitchenette and a bathroom where you could barely turn around. But it was mine, and I felt an immense sense of pride every time I turned the key in the lock. During all this time, I had sporadic contact with my dad. He'd call occasionally, usually drunk, full of apologies and promises to do better. I'd go see him sometimes, in whatever dingy motel room or halfway house he was staying in at the time. Part of me wanted to help him, to save him somehow. But another part, a part that had grown cynical and weary, knew that I couldn't fix him. He had to want to fix himself. Mom, true to her word, had stayed out of my life. Sometimes I'd hear snippets about her from distant relatives or old family friends. Apparently, she and Steve had gotten married. Her real estate career was thriving in her new city. She was active in her stepkids' school and extracurriculars. It seemed she had fully embraced her new life, leaving no room for her old one. I dated a bit during these years, but nothing serious. I had trust issues a mile wide, and the fear of abandonment colored all my relationships. As soon as things started to get serious, I'd find a way to sabotage it. It was easier to be alone than to risk being hurt again. When I was 25, I got the call I had been both dreading and expecting for years. My dad had died, alone in a dingy motel room. The official cause was liver failure, but I knew he had really died of a broken heart years ago. I identified his body at the morgue. He looked smaller somehow, shrunken and pale. I mourned him, but I also felt a sense of relief. At least he wasn't suffering anymore. I was his only next of kin, so I had to handle all the arrangements. There wasn't much to handle. He had no assets, no insurance. I scraped together enough money for a modest cremation and scattered his ashes in the park where we used to play catch, back in what felt like another lifetime. I half expected my mom to show up at the memorial service I arranged, but she didn't. She sent a generic sympathy card with a check enclosed, to help with expenses, the note said. I tore up the check and threw the card away. Life went on. I continued working at the garage, now as the head mechanic. Mike was talking about retiring in a few years and hinted that he might be interested in selling the business to me. It was more than I ever thought I'd achieve, and I threw myself into learning the business side of things. I also started taking some night classes at the community college. Nothing fancy, just a few business courses to help me understand accounting and management better. But it felt good to be learning again, to be working towards something. I had a small but solid group of friends, mostly guys from the garage and a few people I'd met through my classes. We'd get together for beers and barbecues on weekends, watch football games, normal stuff. I even started dating someone, Rachel, a kindergarten teacher I met through a mutual friend. It was early days, but for the first time, I felt like I might be ready for a real relationship. I thought I had finally put my past behind me and was moving forward. And then, about 6 months ago, I got a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered it. It was my mom. She was crying, barely coherent. Through her sobs, I pieced together what had happened. Steve, her perfect husband, had been cheating on her for years, apparently. When she found out and confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he told her he wanted a divorce and kicked her out of the house. Her perfect stepchildren, who she had raised as her own for the past 16 years, sided with their father. They wanted nothing to do with her. She had nowhere to go, no money of her own. Steve had controlled all the finances, and no one to turn to. Except me. The child she had abandoned all those years ago. I listened in silence as she begged for my help. She said she was sorry, that she had made a terrible mistake, that she wanted to make things right. She asked if she could come stay with me, just until she got back on her feet. I felt numb. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her to go to hell and never contact me again. To let her feel even a fraction of the abandonment and despair I had felt. But another part, a part I thought had died long ago, felt a flicker of something. Not quite hope, but maybe curiosity? A chance for closure? In the end, I told her I needed time to think. I hung up and just sat there, staring at the wall, for what felt like hours. Over the next few days, I was a mess. I couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't sleep. I kept replaying my childhood in my head, remembering the good times before she left, and the pain that followed. I thought about my dad, how different our lives might have been if she had stayed. I wondered what Mike and Linda would say. They had become like surrogate parents to me over the years. I talked to my friends, to Rachel, even to the therapist I had started seeing a few years back. Yes, I finally admitted I needed help dealing with my issues. They all had different opinions, but they all agreed on one thing: whatever I decided, it had to be for me, not for her. After a week of agonizing, I called her back. I told her she could stay with me, but there were conditions. First, it was temporary, 3 months max. Second, she had to get a job and contribute to expenses. Third, and most importantly, we had to go to family therapy together. If she wasn't willing to put in the work to repair our relationship, then this wasn't going to work. She agreed to everything, sounding relieved and grateful. We made arrangements, and a week later, she showed up at my door with 2 suitcases and a look of apprehension on her face. The woman standing in front of me was both familiar and a stranger. She looked older, of course. There were lines around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before, and her hair was starting to gray at the temples. But it was more than that. The confident, put-together woman I remembered from my childhood was gone, replaced by someone who looked broken. The first few weeks were awkward, to say the least. We tiptoed around each other, making small talk about the weather and what to have for dinner. I gave her the bedroom and took the couch. My apartment really wasn't meant for 2 people. She tried to insist on taking the couch, but I shut that down quickly. I wasn't ready to sacrifice my comfort for her. We started therapy almost immediately. Our therapist, Dr. Chen, was a calm, no-nonsense woman who didn't let either of us off the hook. In our first session, she had us each talk about our expectations for this arrangement. I was brutally honest. I told my mom I didn't trust her, that I was angry, that I didn't know if I could ever forgive her. She cried, but I felt nothing. Years of built-up resentment had left me numb to her tears. Slowly, as we continued therapy and spent more time together, the walls began to come down. I learned about her life over the past 16 years. How Steve had slowly isolated her from her friends and family, how he controlled every aspect of her life. How she had regretted leaving me almost immediately, but felt trapped in her new life. How she had convinced herself that I was better off without her, even as she longed to reach out. None of this excused what she had done, of course. But it helped me understand, at least a little bit. I began to see her not as this larger-than-life figure who had ruined my life, but as a flawed, human woman who had made a terrible mistake. For her part, my mom listened as I poured out years of pain and anger. I told her about the struggles with Dad, about foster care, about the years of feeling unwanted and unloved. I saw the pain in her eyes as she realized the full impact of her actions, and for the first time, I felt like she truly understood what she had done. There were sessions where we both left in tears, emotionally drained but somehow lighter. It wasn't all heavy conversations and tears, though. As the weeks went by, we started to have moments of normalcy, I guess you could call it. We cooked dinner together sometimes, fumbling through recipes and laughing at our culinary disasters. We watched movies, arguing good-naturedly over what to watch. She loves rom-coms, I'm more of an action movie guy. Sometimes, late at night, we'd sit on the tiny balcony of my apartment, drinking tea and talking about nothing in particular. One night, about a month into her stay, she asked about the photos I had on my bookshelf. There weren't many, a few of me with Mike and Linda, one with my friends from the garage, and one of Rachel and me at a concert. She picked up the one of Mike and Linda at my high school graduation, her fingers tracing the edge of the frame. "They seem like wonderful people," she said softly. I nodded. "They are. They saved me, in a lot of ways." She put the photo back carefully, her hands shaking slightly. "I'm glad you had them," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry it couldn't be me." It was the first time she had apologized so directly, without qualifications or excuses. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded again and changed the subject. But something shifted between us that night. Meanwhile, my mom was working hard to get her life back on track. She got a job at a local diner, working long hours for not much pay. But she never complained, seeming almost eager to prove herself. She went to therapy religiously, both our family sessions and individual ones. She made an effort to get to know my friends, to understand my life. Rachel was incredibly understanding about the whole situation. She offered to give us space, but I found myself wanting her around more, not less. She became a source of stability in the emotional roller coaster I was on. My mom and Rachel got along well, which was both a relief and strangely unsettling. Seeing them chat over coffee in my kitchen felt surreal, like two separate parts of my life colliding. As the 3-month mark approached, I found myself dreading the day she would leave. We weren't magically healed, far from it. We still had arguments, still had moments of tension and resentment. But we were making progress, slow and steady. One particularly bad day stands out in my memory. It was about 2.5 months into her stay. We were having dinner, and somehow the conversation turned to my dad. My mom made a comment about how she couldn't handle his drinking anymore, and something in me snapped. I exploded, yelling at her that she had no right to criticize him, that his drinking only got bad after she left, that if she had stayed, maybe he'd still be alive. I said horrible things, dredging up every ounce of pain and resentment I'd been holding on to for years. She sat there and took it, tears streaming down her face. When I finally ran out of steam, she quietly said, "You're right. I failed both of you. I'm so sorry." I stormed out, slamming the door behind me. I walked for hours, my mind racing. When I finally came back, I found her sitting on the couch, red-eyed but calm. We talked until the early hours of the morning, really talked, in a way we hadn't before. It was painful and raw, but also cathartic. We both went to bed emotionally exhausted but feeling like we'd finally lanced a festering wound. The next day, I made a decision. I asked her if she wanted to stay longer, to keep working on our relationship. The look of joy and relief on her face when I asked is something I'll never forget. It's been 6 months now since that first phone call. My mom is still living with me, though she's talking about getting her own place soon. She's been promoted to manager at the diner and is taking some online classes to improve her job prospects. We're still in therapy, still working through years of hurt and mistrust. But we're also building new memories, creating a new kind of relationship. I'm not going to lie and say everything is perfect. There are still days when I feel angry, when the pain of the past overwhelms me. There are times when I wonder if I'm making a mistake, if I'm setting myself up for more heartbreak. But then I'll come home from work to find dinner on the table, or we'll share a laugh over some silly TV show, and I think maybe, just maybe, this could work. We can't erase the past, but we can try to build a better future. Last week, I introduced her to Mike and Linda. I was nervous about it, feeling like I was somehow betraying them by letting my mom back into my life. But they were gracious and kind, as always. After dinner, Linda pulled me aside and told me she was proud of me for giving my mom a second chance. "Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself," she said. "It doesn't mean forgetting, It means choosing to move forward. As for my relationship with Rachel, it's grown stronger through all of this. She's been my rock, offering support without trying to influence my decisions. We're talking about moving in together soon, which is both exciting and terrifying. I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully forgive my mom, or if our relationship will ever be what it could have been. But I'm glad I gave her this chance, glad I gave us this chance. To those of you who have read this far, thank you. Writing this all out has been cathartic in a way I didn't expect. If you're in a similar situation, I don't have any grand advice. Every situation is different, every relationship unique. And Mom, if you ever stumble across this, though I doubt you even know what Reddit is, know that I'm trying. It's not easy, and some days I'm not sure it's worth it. But I'm trying. I hope you are too.